Section 4. Modern Science and the Fairy Faith, and Conclusions. Chapter 11. Science and Fairies. Puzzling and weird occurrences have been vouched for among all nations and in every age. It is possible to relegate a good many asserted occurrences to the domain of superstition, but it is not possible thus to eliminate all. Sir Oliver Lodge. Method of examination, exoteric and esoteric aspects. The ex-quantity scientific attitudes toward the animistic hypothesis, materialistic theory, pathological theory, delusion and imposture theory. Problems of consciousness, dreams. Supernormal lapse of time. Psychical research and fairies. Myers's research's present position of psychical research and anthropology in relation to fairy faith, according to a special contribution from Mr. Andrew Lang. Final testing of the ex-quantity conclusion, the Celtic belief in fairies and in fairyland is scientific. Method of examination. The promise made in the introduction to examine the why of the belief in fairies must now be fulfilled by calling in the aid of modern science. To adduce parallels when studying a religion or a mythology is worth doing, in order to show the fundamental bond which unites all systems of belief in things called spiritual. But it is more important to try to understand why there should be such parallels and such a unifying principle behind them. Perhaps there has been too much of a tendency among students of folklore, and of anthropology as a whole, to be content to do no more than to discover that the Eskimos in Greenland hold a belief in spirits parallel to a belief in spirits held in Central Africa. Or that the Greek pantheon, and possibly the Celtic one as well, consists of goddesses which are apparently pre-Aryan and of gods which are apparently Aryan. We, too, have drawn many parallels between the Celtic fairy faith and the various fairy faiths throughout the world, but now we should attempt to find out why there are animistic beliefs at all. This chapter, then, will confine itself to a scientific examination of the more popular or, as it may be called, the exoteric aspect of the fairy faith, which has come to us directly from the masses of the Celtic peoples. The following chapter, which is corollary to the present one, will deal especially with the mystical aspect or, as this may be called by contrast, the esoteric aspect of the same belief, which, in turn, has come to us from learned mystics and seers, who form, in proportion, but a very small minority of the modern Celts. Each of these complementary aspects of the Celtic religion undoubtedly has its origin in the remotest antiquity. This is probably more readily seen with respect to the former than to the latter. The latter has been esoteric always, and in our opinion shows an unbroken tradition, if only a very incomplete one, from Druidic times. And it depends less upon written records, because the Druids had none, than upon oral transmission from age to age. Both aspects of the fairy faith have in modern times absorbed many ideas from non-Celtic systems of religion and mystical thought. As Mr. Jenner has suggested in his introduction for Cornwall, and as certain details in Chapter 2 clearly indicate, systems of modern theosophy have had a marked influence in this respect. But it is impossible for us today to say what parts of the fairy faith are purely Celtic and what are not so, because comparative studies prove that mysticism is fundamentally the same in all ages and among all peoples. It is psychologically true, also, that there must always exist some sort of affinity between two sets of thought in order for them to coalesce. Hence, if modern mysticism, derived from Oriental or other sources, has, as we believe, affected Celtic mysticism as handed down from the dim Druidic ages, it is merely because the two occupy a common psychical territory. We must therefore be content to examine scientifically the fairy faith as it now presents itself. The analysis of evidence in Chapter 3 indicates clearly that there is in the exoteric part of the modem Celtic belief in fairies considerable degeneration from what must have been in pagan times a widespread and highly developed animistic creed. In the esoteric part of it there will be observed, instead of such degeneracy, a surprisingly elaborate system of the most subtle speculation, which parallels that of East Indian systems of metaphysics. If the belief be looked at in this comprehensive manner, it seems to be clear that to some extent at least, as has been pointed out already, pp. 99, 257, the fairy faith in its purest form originated amongst the most highly educated and scientific Celts of ancient times rather than among their unlearned fellows. The two aspects of the belief form an harmonious whole as they will be presented in this section 4. Chapter 11 depends mostly upon the evidence set forth in Chapter 2. Chapter 12 depends mostly upon the evidence set forth in Chapter 7. In Chapter 3 we examined anthropologically the modern, and, both there and in parts of chapters following, the historical and ancient belief in fairies in Celtic countries, and found it to be in essence animistic. Folk imagination, social psychology, anthropomorphism generally, adequately explained by far the greater mass of the evidence presented. But the animistic background of the belief in question presented problems which the strictly anthropological sciences are unable to solve. The point has now been reached when these problems must be presented to physiology and to psychology for solution. If they can be completely solved by purely rational and physical data, then the fairy faith as a whole will have to be cast aside as worthless in the eyes of science. In our generation, however, such a casting aside is not to be the fate of the folk religion of the Celts. The following phenomena recorded in Chapter 2 and elsewhere throughout our study, and designated as the X or unknown quantity of the fairy faith, cannot at the present time be satisfactorily explained by science. 1. Collective hallucinations and veridical hallucinations. 2. Objects moving without contact. 3. Raps and noises called supernatural, for telepathy. 5. Seership and visions. 6. Dream and trance states manifesting supernormal knowledge. 7. Mediumship or spirit possession. Independently of our own Celtic data in their support, the first class of phenomena are supported by an enormous mass of good data scientifically collected. The second and third class are less well supported. Telepathy is almost generally accepted as now being established. The last three classes are hypothetically accepted by many authorities in pathology, psychology, and psychical research. Scientific attitudes towards the animistic hypothesis. Assertions similar to ours, that phenomena like these are incapable of being explained away by any known laws of orthodox science, have helped to bring about a marked division in the ranks of scientific workers. On one hand there are those scientists who deny the existence of anything not capable of being mathematically tested, weighed, dissected, or otherwise analyzed in laboratories. On the other hand, there are their colleagues who, often in spite of previous bias toward materialism, have arrived at a personal conviction that an animistic view of man is more in harmony with their scientific experience than any other. Both schools include men eminent in all branches of biological sciences. Midway between these contending schools are the psychophysicists who maintain that man is a twofold being composed of a psychical and physical part. Some of them are inclined to favor animism, others are unwilling to regard the psychical part of man as separable from the physical part. So the world of science is divided. Under such chaotic conditions of science it is our right to accept one view or another, or to reject all views and use scientific data independently. There can be no final court of appeal in matters where opinion is thus divided, save the experience of coming generations. We are therefore content to state our own position and leave it to the future for rejection or acceptance, as the case may be. To attempt a critical examination of the 1001 theories occupying the modern arena of scientific controversy about the essential nature of man is altogether beyond the scope of this work. We must, nevertheless, blaze a rough footpath through the jungle of scientific theories, and, at the outset, put on record our opposition to that school of scientific workers who deny to man a supersensuous constitution. Their theory, if carried out to its logical conclusion, is now essentially no different from Feuerbach's theory at a time when science was far less developed than it is today. He held that, the object of sense, or the sensuous, alone is really true, and therefore truth, reality, and the sensible are one. 600 To say that we know reality through sensual perception is an error, as all schools of scientists must nowadays admit. Nature is forever eluding the senses, she masquerades in disguise until science tears away her mask. We must always adjust the senses to the world itself, where there are only vibrations in ether, man sees light, and in atmospheric vibrations he hears sound. We only know things through the way in which our senses react upon them. We sum up the world problem by saying, consciousness does not exhaust its object, the world. Perceptibility and reality thus not being coincident, man and the universe remain an unsolved problem, despite the noisy shoutings of the materialist in his hermetically sealed and light-excluding case called sensual perceptions. Science admits that all her explanations of the universe are mere products of human understanding and perceptions by the physical senses. The universe of science is wholly a universe of phenomena, and behind phenomena. As no scientist would dare deny, there must be the noumena, the ultimate causes of all things, as to which science as yet offers no comprehensive hypothesis, much less an answer. To consider the materialistic hypothesis as adequate to account for the residuum or ex-quantity of the fairy faith would not even be reasonable, and, incontestably, would not be scientific. When scientists holding to the non-animistic view of life are driven from their now for the most part abandoned fortress built by German scientists of the last century, of whom Feuerbach was a type, they, in opposing the animists, occupy a more modernly equipped fortress called the pathological theory. This theory is that mediumship, telepathy, hallucinations, or the voluntary and involuntary exercise of any so-called psychical faculties on the part of men and women, with the resulting phenomena, can be explained as due to abnormal and hence according to its point of view diseased states of the human organism, or to some derangement of bodily functions, leading to delusions resembling those of insanity, which by a sort of hypnosis telepathically induced may even affect researchers and lead them into erroneous conclusions. All scientists are in agreement with the pathological theory in so far as it rejects as unworthy of serious consideration all apparitions and abnormal phenomena save those observed by sane and healthy percipients under ordinary conditions. And, accordingly, whenever there can be shown in our percipients a diseased mental or psychical state, we must eliminate their testimony without argument. But since we have endeavored to present no testimony from Celtic percipients who are not physically and psychically normal, the pathological theory at best can affect the ex-quantity merely hypothetically. The following admission in regard to visual and auditory hallucinations is here worth noting as coming from so thorough an exponent of materialistic psychology as M. Theodore Ribot. There must exist anatomical and physiological causes which would solve the problem, but unfortunately they are hidden from us. Of these hidden causes, which he thinks create all psychical states of mind or consciousness called by him disease of personality, M. Ribot says, our ignorance of the causes stops us short. The psychologist is here like the physician who has to deal with a disease in which he can make out only the symptoms. What physiological influences are they which thus alter the general tone of the organism, consequently of the choanaesthesis, consequently too of the memory? Is it some condition of the vascular system? Or some inhibitory action, some arrest of function? We cannot say. 601 And after 6 years of most careful experimentation, M. Charles Richet, professor of physiology in the Faculty of Medicine in Paris, reached this conclusion: there exists in certain persons at certain moments a faculty of acquiring knowledge which has no rapport with our normal faculties of that kind. 602 We seem to have here the last words of science touching the pathological theory. When driven from their pathological stronghold, and they maintain that they have not been driven from it, the non-animists always find a safe way to cover their retreat by setting up the charge that all psychical phenomena are fraudulent or else due to delusion on the part of observers. In reply, psychical researchers readily admit that there is a large percentage of mere trickery, delusion, and imposture in observed spirit phenomena, some of which is deliberate on the part of the medium, and some of which is apparently not consciously induced. Nevertheless, such investigators are not at all willing to say that there is nothing more than this. The delusion and imposture theory will account for a very respectable proportion of these phenomena, but not for all of them, and theoretically we shall admit its application to the parallel phenomena attributed to fairies. Though it must be acknowledged that fairy phenomena are for the most part spontaneously exhibited rather than as in spiritualism, set up through holding séances. Further, there are comparatively few charmers, or wise men, the fairy mediums, among the Celts who ever make money out of their ability to deal with the good people, or tylwyth teg. Whence the margin of encouragement for fraudulent production of fairy phenomena is extremely limited when compared with spiritualism. After 25 years of experimentation, more or less continuous, with mediums during which every conceivable test for the detection of fraud on their part was applied, William James put his conclusions on record in these words: when imposture has been checked off as far as possible, when chance coincidence has been allowed for, when opportunities for normal knowledge on the part of the subject have been noted, and skill in fishing and following clues unwittingly furnished by the voice or face of bystanders have been counted in. Those who have the fullest acquaintance with the phenomena admit that in good mediums there is a residuum of knowledge displayed, italics are James's own, that can only be called supernormal. The medium taps some source of information not open to ordinary people. 603 Mr. Andrew Lang, one of the bravest of psychical researchers in England, not only would agree with William James in this, but, having carefully examined the delusion and imposture theory from the more commanding point of view of an anthropologist, would go further and include classical spiritualistic phenomena as well as those existing among contemporary uncultured races. He says, meanwhile, the extraordinary similarity of savage and classical spiritualistic rites, with the corresponding similarity of alleged modern phenomena, raises problems which it is more easy to state than to solve. For example, such occurrences as rappings, as the movement of untouched objects, as the lights of the séance room, are all easily feigned. But that ignorant modern knaves should feign precisely the same raps, lights, and movements as the most remote and unsophisticated barbarians, and as the educated Platonists of the 4th century after Christ, and that many of the other phenomena should be identical in each case, is certainly noteworthy. 604 Evidently, then, there is a large proportion of psychical and fairy phenomena which remain unexplained even after the delusion and imposture theory has been applied to such phenomena. And in all such cases we must look further for a scientific explanation. Problems of consciousness. Our chief investigations will at first be directed more especially to the problems common both to psychology and to psychical research, namely, dream and trance states, hallucinations, and possessions. In order to show what bearings, if any, they have in the eyes of science upon parallel phenomena said to be due to fairies, and set forth in Chapter 2 and anthropologically examined in Chapter 3. Dreams. The popular opinion that dreams are nonsense is quite overthrown by definite psychological facts. When during sleep our sensory organs are exposed to external irritants, the impressions physically produced are transmitted to the brain by the nervous system and react in dreams as they would in the waking state. Except that the reactions in the two states of consciousness, the dream state and the waking state, differ in proportion as the two states differ. But in both the ego is the real percipient. 605 Such stimuli as arise from after-theater dinners, wine parties, and so forth, produce a well-known type of dreams. And the same stimuli at the same period of time would produce an equal effect, though an altered one, to suit the altered psychophysical conditions, if the waking state were active rather than the dream state. Just as would all dreams which arise from pathological disturbances in disease, or abnormal physiological functions. This is evident from dreams of a morbid and sensual type, which directly affect the physical organism and its functions as parallel waking states would. In all such dreams of the lower order, animal and purely physical tendencies, which are directly due to the state of the body, act very freely, and imperfectly balanced, temporarily deranged. Or diseased organism must correspondingly respond to its driving forces. And it is clear from comparative study of phenomena that these lower kinds of dream states express only the lower or animal consciousness, which in most individuals is the predominant or only consciousness even in the waking life. And not the higher consciousness of the ego or subconsciousness which may be expressed in somnambulism, for, in somnambulism there awakes an inner, second ego. 606 which is the subliminal self of Myers. Dr. G. F. Stout urges against Myers's theory of the subliminal self that the usual incoherence of dreams is an objection to regarding them as manifestations of a stream of thought equal or superior in systematic complexity and continuity to that of the waking self. 607 which objection Myers also observed. But if we regard all dreams which are of the lower order as being due to the imperfect response of the body to its driving forces because of various bad physical conditions in the body, and recognize that these driving forces depend ultimately on the subconsciousness, the difficulty seems to be met by observing that under such conditions there is no real mergence of the normal consciousness into the subconsciousness. Hence ordinary dreams are within the ordinary spectrum of consciousness, but extraordinary dreams pass beyond the ordinary spectrum into the truly supernormal state of consciousness. As all this indicates, dreams are of many classes, those of the lowest type, which we have explained as due to bad physiological conditions in the animal man. Those which are readily explainable as distorted reflections of waking actions, often based on some stray thought or suggestion of the day and then comparable to post-hypnotic suggestions. Other dreams are demonstrably entirely outside the range of ordinary mental or physical disturbances, actions, reflections, or suggestions of the waking life, and seem thus to have a wider purview, and to indicate that the record of external events which is kept within us is far fuller than we know. 608 In some dreams there is reasoning as well as memory. And mathematicians have been known to solve problems in sleep. An American inventor known to the writer's mother asserted that he had dreamt out the details of a certain ice manufacturing process which proved successful when tested. Through self-suggestion set up in the waking state, R. L. Stevenson, upon entering the dream state, secured details for his imaginary romances. 609 Dr. Stout himself, in criticizing Myers's subliminal self, admits that, in some very rare instances, a man has achieved, while dreaming, intellectual performances equaling or perhaps surpassing the best of which he was capable in waking life. 610 And there are many authentic cases of dream experiences which cannot possibly be explained as revivals of facts fallen out of the range of the ordinary memory or consciousness. We seem to be led to some hypothesis like this: in dreaming there is mental activity which in the waking state is either functionless or else below the psychophysical threshold of sensibility. Because much that is subconscious in the non-dream state is in the dream state fully conscious. And we probably do not remember 1/4 of our dreams. They belong to a mainly different order of consciousness. Professor Freud's view of dreams coincides pretty generally with this view. He holds that the subconsciousness is the storehouse out of which dream contents are drawn and acted upon by the dream mind. Very much distortion of the subconscious material takes place in the process, due to what he calls the endopsychic censor. In the waking state this censor is always on the alert to keep out of consciousness all subconscious processes or deposits, but in sleep the censor is less alert, and allows some subconscious content to escape over into the ordinary consciousness. The result is a dream distorted out of all recognition of its origin. Such a dream seems to occupy a position midway between what we have classed as the lowest or animal mind dream and the highest or subliminal dream. It possibly shows an harmonious psychophysical condition of the dream life, whereas the lowest type of dream shows the preponderance of the physical or animal, and the highest type of dream shows the preponderance of the psychical elements in man. Further, it may be designated as the normal dream, and the other two types respectively as the physically abnormal and the psychically abnormal. Professor Freud detects other marked processes in the dream state, all of which help to illustrate the part of the fairy faith dependent upon dreaming experiences. 1. There is condensation of details frequently in a proportion so great as 1:10 and 1:20. 2. Displacement of details, or a transvaluation of all values. 3. Much dramatization. 4. Regression, a retrograde movement of abstract mental processes toward their primary conceptions. And 5. Secondary elaboration, an attempt to rationalize all dream material. 611 Also, Professor Freud discovered from his analysis of thousands of dreams that the subconsciousness makes use of a sort of symbolism. This symbolism in part varies with the individual, but in part is of a typical nature, and seems to be identical with the symbolism which we suppose to lie behind our myths and legends. It is not impossible that these latter creations of the people may find their explanation from the study of dreams. 612 Such processes, taken as a whole, show that man possesses a twofold consciousness, the ordinary consciousness and the subconsciousness. And we have every reason to believe that subconscious activities go on continually, in waking and in sleeping. By experiments on his own perfectly healthy children, Weinhold proved that there are natural forces existing whose stimulations are never perceived in waking life. He made passes over the face and neck of his son with an iron key at the distance of half an inch without touching him. Whereupon the boy began to rub those parts and manifested uneasiness. Weinhold likewise experimented on his other children with lead, zinc, gold, and other metals, and in most cases the children averted the parts so treated, rubbed them, or drew the clothes over them. 613 Therefore, in sleep the consciousness perceives objects without physical contact. And this not inconceivably might suggest, inversely, that in sleep the human consciousness can affect objects without physical contact, as it is said fairies and the dead can, and in the way psychical researchers know that objects can be affected. We have on record an account of a most remarkable dream quite the same in character as dreams wherein certain Celts believe they have met the dead or fairies. Professor Hilprecht had a broken Assyrian cylinder in cuneiform which he could not decipher, but in a dream an Assyrian priest in ancient garb appeared to him and deciphered the inscription. Of this dream Myers observed, "We seem to have reached the utmost intensity of sleep faculty within the limits of our ordinary spectrum." 614. We may sum up the results of our examination of dreams by saying that scientific analysis of the dream life in its higher ranges proves that our ego is not wholly embraced in self-consciousness, that the ego exceeds the self-consciousness. Instead of a continuity of consciousness which constitutes self-consciousness, we have parallel states of consciousness for the one subject, the ego. Our study of the Celtic theory of rebirth, in the following chapter, will further explain this subtle aspect of the dream psychology. When such a conclusion is applied to the fairy faith, the various dreamlike or trance-like states during which ancient and contemporary Celts testify to having been in fairyland are seen to be scientifically plausible. In this aspect then, fairyland, stripped of all its literary and imaginative glamour and of its social psychology, in the eyes of science resolves itself into a reality. Because it is one of the states of consciousness coordinate with the ordinary consciousness. This statement will be confirmed by a brief examination of what is called supernatural lapse of time, and which is invariably connected with fairyland. Supernatural lapse of time. It has already been made clear that in the dream or somnambulic state there are invariably modifications of time and space relations, and these give rise to what has been termed the supernatural lapse of time. Two conditions are possible: either a few minutes of waking state time equal long periods in the non-waking state, or else, as is usually the case in the fairy faith, the reverse is true. The first condition, which we shall examine first, occasionally appears in the fairy faith through such a statement as this: "Sometimes one may thus go to fairy for an hour or two," page 39. Similarly, as physicians well know, patients under narcotics will experience events extending over long periods of time within a few minutes of normal time. De Quincey, the famous opium eater, records dreams of 10 to 60 years supernatural duration, and some quite beyond all limits of the waking experience. Fechner records a case of a woman who was nearly drowned and then resuscitated after 2 minutes of unconsciousness, and who in that time lived over again all her past life. 615 Another even more remarkable case than this last concerns Admiral Beaufort, who, having fallen into the water, was unconscious also for 2 minutes. And yet he says that not only during that short space of time did he travel over every incident of his life with the details of every minute and collateral feature, but that there crowded into his imagination many trifling events which had long been forgotten. 616. We shall now present examples to illustrate the second condition. Hone was in an unbroken magnetic sleep from the 1st of January to the 10th of May, and when he came out of it he was overcome with surprise to see that spring had arrived, he having lain down as he believed only the day before. 617 Had Hone been an Irishman, he might very reasonably have explained the situation by saying that he had been with the fairies for what seemed only a night. The Seeress of Prevorst, in a similar sleep, passed through a period of 6 years and 5 months, and then awoke as from a one-night sleep with no memory of what she did during that time. But some time afterwards memory of the period came to her so completely that she recalled all its details. 618 old people, and some young people too, among the Celts, who go to fairyland for varying periods of time, sometimes extending over weeks, as in a case I knew in West Ireland, have just such dreams or trance states as this. Another example follows. Chardell, in fleeing from the Revolution, took ship from Brittany and was obliged to induce somnambulism on his wife in order to overcome her horror of the sea. When the couple landed in America and Chardell awakened his wife, she had no recollection whatever of the Atlantic voyage, and believed herself still in Brittany. 619. Both Helmholtz and Fechner show 620 that the functions of the nervous system are associated with a definite time measure, so it follows that consciousness in an organic body like man's depends upon the nervous system. But, as these examples and similar ones in the fairy faith show, certain conscious states exist independently of the human nerves. And they therefore set up a strong presumption that complete consciousness can exist independently of the physical nerve apparatus. And in proceeding to submit this presumption of a supersensuous consciousness to the further test of science, we shall at the same time be testing the statements made by wholly reliable seer witnesses, like the Irish mystic and seer, p. 65, that not only can men and women enter fairyland during trance states for a brief period, but that at death they can enter it for an unlimited period. Further, what is for our study the most important of all statements will likewise be tested, namely, that in fairyland there are conscious non-human entities like the city races. Psychical research and fairies. Our present task, then, is to extend the examination beyond incarnate consciousness into the realm of the new psychology or physical research, where, as a working hypothesis, it is assumed that there is discarnate consciousness, which by the Celtic peoples is believed to exist and to exhibit itself in various individual aspects as fairies. As to what science demands as proof of the survival of human consciousness after death, there has been no clear consensus of opinion. To prove merely the existence of ghosts would not do. It is necessary to show by a series of proofs, 1. That discarnate intelligences exist, 2. That they possess complete and persistent personal energy wholly within themselves. 3. That they are the actual unit of consciousness and memory known to have manifested itself on this plane of existence through particular incarnate personalities now deceased. Various psychical researchers assert that they have already reached these proofs and are convinced, often in spite of their initial scientific attitude of antagonism toward all psychic phenomena, of the survival of the human consciousness after the death of the human body. And we shall proceed to present the testimony of some of them. In Chapter 7, concerning phantasms of the dead, forming part of Frederick W. H. Myers's human personality and its survival of bodily death, and in the 2 chapters which follow, on motor automatism, and on trance, possession, and ecstasy, all the necessary proofs above noted have been adduced. And the author was thereby one of the very first psychical researchers to have recorded before the world his conversion from the non-animistic hypothesis to the ancient belief that man is immortal. For he admits his conviction that the human consciousness does incontestably survive the decay of the physical body. Types of some of these well-attested and proved cases offered as evidence by Myers may be briefly summarized as follows: repeated apparitions indicating intimate acquaintance with some post-mortem fact like the place of burial. Single apparitions with knowledge of the affairs of surviving friends, or of the impending death of a survivor, or of spirits of persons dead after the apparition's decease. Cases where professed spirits manifest knowledge of their earth life, as of some secret compact made with survivors, cases of apparitional appearances near a corpse or a grave. Occasional cases of the appearance of the dead to several persons collectively. 621 Under motor automatism, some of the most striking phenomena tending toward proof are cases where automatic writing has announced a death unknown to the persons present. Knowledge communicated in a séance, not known to any person present, but afterwards proved to have been possessed by the deceased, automatic writing by a child in language unknown to her. In Chapter 9 trance or possession is defined by Myers, in the same list of proofs, as a development of motor automatism resulting at last in a substitution of personality. And this harmonizes with the theory of the control of a living organism by discarnate spirits, and is supported by an overwhelming mass of scientific experiment. Telepathy suggests the possibility of communication between the living and between the living and the dead, and, we may add, between the dead and the dead as in fairyland without the consideration of space or time as known in the lower ranges of mental action. And that the communication does not depend upon vibrations from a material brain mass. Telepathy in these first two aspects has been likewise accepted as a scientific fact by workers in psychical research like Sir William Crookes, Sir Oliver Lodge, William James, and by many others. All such phenomena as these, now being so carefully investigated and weighed by men thoroughly trained in science, are, so to speak, the protoplasmic background of all religions, philosophies, or systems of mystical thought yet evolved on this planet. And in all essentials they confirm the X-quantity presented in the evidence of the fairy faith. Dr. G. F. Stout, an able representative of the school of non-converts to the theories in psychology propounded by Myers and by psychical research, states his position thus, but, at least, my doubt is not dogmatic denial, and I agree with Mr. Myers that there is no sufficient reason for being peculiarly skeptical concerning communications from departed spirits. I also agree with him that the alleged cases of such communication cannot be with any approach to probability explained away as mere instances of telepathy. 622 In addition, Dr. Stout says, the conception which has been really useful to him is that of telepathy. Given that communication takes place between individual minds unmediated by ordinary physical conditions, we may regard intercourse with departed spirits as a special case of the same kind of process. And clairvoyance, precognition, and may perhaps be referred to telepathic communication either with departed spirits or with other intelligences superior to the human. 623 In this last phrase, intelligences superior to the human, Dr. Stout assumes our own position, that hypothetically there is good reason for thinking that discarnate non-human intelligences such as the Irish call the Sidhe may exist and communicate with, or influence in some unknown way, the living. As during mediumship and in seership. Mr. Andrew Lang points out, in his reply to Dr. Stout's criticism, that the only legitimate scientific resource for overthrowing Myers's position, since the evidence is mathematically incapable of explanation by chance coincidence, is to say that several people are deliberate forgers and liars. And he adds, to myself, but only to myself and a small circle, the evidence is irrefragable, from our lifetime knowledge of the percipient. 624 But the animistic position does not by any means depend upon the evidence presented by Myers, no matter how incontestably reliable it is. We have only to examine the voluminous publications of the Society for Psychical Research, London, to realize this, and especially the report on the Census of Hallucinations of Modern Spiritualism, by Professor Sidgwick's Committee, P.S.P.R. London. Psychical Research and Anthropology in Relation to the Fairy Faith. According to a special contribution from Mr. Andrew Lang. Mr. Andrew Lang, who has done a special service to science by showing that psychical research is inseparably related to anthropology, has favored us with a statement of his own position toward this relationship and has made it directly applicable to the fairy faith. In a general way, but not in some important details, as indicated in our annotations, we agree with Mr. Lang's position, which he states as follows. Mr. Evans-Wentz has asked me to define my position towards psychical research in relation to anthropology. I have done so in my book, The Making of Religion. The alleged abnormal or supernormal occurrences which psychical research examines are, for the most part, universally human, and, whether they happen or do not happen, whether they are the results of malobservation, or of fraud, or are merely mythical, as human they cannot be wisely neglected by anthropology. The fairy folk, under many names, in many tongues, are everywhere objects of human belief, in Central Australia, in New Zealand, in the Isles of the Pacific, as in the British Isles, Lowland or Highland, Celtic in the main, or English in the main. I conceive the various beings, fairies, brownies, Irunterinia, jinns, or what you will, to be purely mythical. I am incapable of believing that they are actual entities, who carry off men and women, steal and hide objects, especially as the Iruntarenia do, love or hate, persecute or kiss human beings, practice music, vocal and instrumental. And in short, play the pliskies with which they are universally credited by the identical workings of the human fancy. They tend to shade away, on one side, into the denizens of the house of Hades phantasms of the dead. The belief in such phantasms may be partially based on experience, whether hallucinatory or otherwise and inexplicably produced. 625. As far as psychical research studies report of these phantasms, it approaches the realm of the fairy queen Proserpine. As far as such research examines the historical or contemporary stories of the poltergeist, it touches on fairies, because the Irish, for example, attribute to the agency of fairies the modern poltergeist phenomena, whether these, in each case, be fraudulent or, up to now, be unexplained. There are not more than 2 or 3 alleged visions of the traditional fairies in the annals of psychical research. And I have met with but few sane and educated persons who profess to have seen phantoms at all resembling the traditional fairy. While phantasms supposed to be of the dead, the dying, and the absent are frequently reported. On the whole, psychical research has very little concern with the fairy belief in its typical forms, and if the researcher did find modern cases of fairy visions alleged by sane and educated percipients, he would be apt to explain them by suggestion acting on the subconscious self. 626. 1. Marlowe's Road, London, W. September 26, 1910. Concerning phantasms of the dead into which, as above pointed out, the fairy folk tend to shade away, Mr. Lang has elsewhere said, on the whole, if the evidence is worth anything, there are real objective ghosts, and there are also telepathic hallucinations, so that the scientific attitude is to believe in both, if in either. 627. And he shows that while anthropologists have explained all animistic beliefs as the results of primitive men's philosophizing on life, death, sleep, dreams, trances, shadows, the phenomena of epilepsy, and the illusions of starvation, normal phenomena, psychological and psychical, might suggest most of the animistic beliefs. 628. In The Making of Religion, Mr. Lang has expanded this anthropological argument so as to make it even more fully embrace psychical research. If we apply the brilliant results of Mr. Lang's investigations to our own, it is apparent that the background of the fairy faith, like that of all religions, is animistic, as we have argued in Chapter 3. That it must have grown up in ancient times into its traditional form out of a pre-Celtic followed by a pre-Christian Celtic religion, these latter due, in turn, to actual psychical experiences, such as hallucinations, visions of different sorts, clairvoyance, mediumship, and magical knowledge on the part of Druid priests and, probably, to some extent, on the part of the common people as well. And, finally, that the living fairy faith depends not so much upon ancient traditions, oral and recorded, as upon recent and contemporary psychical experiences, vouched for by many seers and other percipients among our witnesses, and now placed on record by us in Chapter 2 and elsewhere throughout this study. The present position of psychical research. Sir William Crookes, the well-known English authority in physical science, was almost the first scientist to become seriously interested in psychics. And in Part 3 of Notes of an Inquiry into the Phenomena called Spiritual, during the years 1870 to 1873, London, boldly affirms, it will be seen that the facts are of the most astounding character, and seem utterly irreconcilable with all known theories of modern science. Having satisfied myself of their truth, it would be moral cowardice to withhold my testimony because my previous publications were ridiculed by critics and others. And this conclusion reached 40 years ago has not been reversed, but has been confirmed by one after another of learned scientists on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1908, Sir Oliver Lodge, principal of the University of Birmingham, and at present one of the best known of scientists concerned with the study of spiritual phenomena, stated his position thus: on the whole, I am of those who though they would like to see further and still stronger and more continued proofs, are of opinion that a good case has been made out. And that as the best working hypothesis at the present time it is legitimate to grant that lucid moments of intercourse with deceased persons may in the best cases supervene. The boundary between the two states, the known and the unknown, is still substantial, but it is wearing thin in places. And like excavators engaged in boring a tunnel from opposite ends, amid the roar of water and other noises, we are beginning to hear now and again the strokes of the pickaxes of our comrades on the other side. In 1909, Sir Oliver Lodge published The Survival of Man, in which, after a careful exposition, covering over 300 pages, of the definite results of much scientific experimentation by the best scientists of Europe and America, in such psychical phenomena as telepathy or thought transference, telepathy and clairvoyance, automatism and lucidity, the following tentative conclusion is reached: the first thing we learn, perhaps the only thing we clearly learn in the first instance, is continuity. There is no such sudden break in the conditions of existence as may have been anticipated, and no break at all in the continuous and conscious identity of genuine character and personality. 629 And his personal conviction is that intelligent cooperation between other than embodied human minds than our own has become possible. 630. William James, who was one of the chief psychical researchers in the United States, published his conclusions in October 1909. And of psychical phenomena he wrote: as to there being such real natural types of phenomena ignored by orthodox science, I am not baffled at all, for I am fully convinced of it. Of mediumship, he postulated the very interesting theory of a universally diffused soul stuff, which elsewhere, p. 254, we have referred to as the scientific equivalent to the Polynesian manna. My own dramatic sense tends instinctively to picture the situation as an interaction between slumbering faculties in the automatist's mind and a cosmic environment of other consciousness of some sort which is able to work upon them. If there were in the universe a lot of diffuse soul stuff, unable of itself to get into consistent personal form, or to take permanent possession of an organism, yet always craving to do so, it might get its head into the air, parasitically, so to speak, by profiting, by weak spots in the armor of human minds, and slipping in and stirring up there the sleeping tendencies to personate. Expanding this theory into a panpsychic view of the universe and assuming a mother sea of consciousness, a bank upon which we all draw, James asked these questions about it, which educated Celtic seers ask themselves about the Sidhe or fairy world and its also collective consciousness or life. What is its own structure? What is its inner topography? What are the conditions of individuation or insulation in this mother sea? To what tracts, to what active systems functioning separately in it, do personalities correspond? Are individual spirits constituted there? How numerous, and of how many hierarchic orders may these then be? How permanent? How transient? And how confluent with one another may they become? 631 We should ask the reader to compare this scientific attitude with the almost identical attitude taken up with respect to the Sidhe races and the constitution of their world and life by the Irish mystic and seer, pages 60 ff. M. Camille Flammarion, the well-known French astronomer, is another of the pioneer psychical researchers. And in his psychic studies, entitled, as translated in an English edition, The Unknown, recently announced these definite conclusions. 1. The soul exists as a real entity independent of the body. 2. It is endowed with faculties still unknown to science. 3. It is able to act at a distance, without the intervention of the senses. And in his Mysterious Psychic Forces, Boston, 1907, pp. 452-3, he says, the conclusions of the present work concord with those of the former, the unknown. I may sum up the whole matter with the single statement that there exists in nature, in myriad activity, a psychic element the essential nature of which is still hidden from us. The final testing of the X quantity. This chapter can now be brought to its logical conclusion by directly applying the results so far attained to our still vigorous X quantity or residuum gathered out of the fairy faith. We have, although hurriedly, blazed a rough pathway through the necessary parts of the jungle of scientific theories, and have arrived at a very considerable clearing made by the pioneers, the psychical researchers. We seem, in fact, to have arrived at a point in our long investigations where we can postulate scientifically, on the showing of the data of psychical research, the existence of such invisible intelligences as gods, genii, demons, all kinds of true fairies, and disembodied men. It is not necessary to produce here, in addition to what already has been set forth, the very voluminous detailed evidence of psychical research as to the existence of such intelligences. The general statement may be made that there are hundreds of carefully proven cases of phenomena or apparitions precisely like many of those which the Celtic peoples attribute to fairies. 632. Various explanations or theories are offered by our men of science as to what these invisible intelligences are, for none of our scientists would say that the dead alone are responsible, even in a majority of cases, for the observed phenomena and apparitions, but rather such beings as we call demons, fairies, and elementals. M. Camille Flammarion says, the greater part of the phenomena observed noises, movement of tables, confusions, disturbances, raps, replies to questions asked are really childish, puerile, vulgar, often ridiculous, and rather resemble the pranks of mischievous boys than serious bona fide actions. It is impossible not to notice this. Why should the souls of the dead amuse themselves in this way? The supposition seems almost absurd. 633. There could be no better description of the pranks which house-haunting fairies like brownies and Robin Goodfellows and elementals enjoy than this, and to suppose that the dead perform such mischievous and playful acts is, in truth, absurd. M. Flammarion also says, two inescapable hypotheses present themselves. Either it is we who produce these phenomena, and this is not reasonable, or it is spirits. But mark this well, these spirits are not necessarily the souls of the dead. For other kinds of spiritual beings may exist, and space may be full of them without our ever knowing anything about it, except under unusual circumstances. Do we not find in the different ancient literatures, demons, angels, gnomes, goblins, sprites, specters, elementals, and perhaps these legends are not without some foundation in fact. 634. On the phenomena of percussive and allied sounds such as fairies and the dead are said to produce. Sir William Crookes made this report: the intelligence governing the phenomena is sometimes manifestly below that of the medium. It is frequently in direct opposition to the wishes of the medium. The intelligence is sometimes of such a character as to lead to the belief that it does not emanate from any person present. 635. In the case of the medium, Mr. Home, Sir William Crookes used mechanical tests and proved to his own satisfaction that physical objects moved without Mr. Home or any other person being in contact with them. 636. In the way that fairies are believed to move objects. These phenomena parallel remarkable ancient and modern examples of the same nature, e.g. in the affair at Sideville, France, brought before a magistrate, there is sworn evidence by reputable witnesses that pillows and coverlets floated away from a bed in which two children were asleep, and that furniture in the house moved without contact. 637. Mrs. Margaret Quinn, originally of Mullingar, but now of Howth, gave this remarkable testimony: when I was a little girl, I lived with my mother in Westmeath, near Mullingar. A fort was at the back of our house, and mother used to hear music playing round our house all night, and she has seen them, the good people. It often happened there at home that we would have clothes out on the line and they would float off like a balloon at a time when there would not be a bit of wind and in daylight. My mother would come out and say, "God bless them, the good people. They will bring them back." And then the clothes would slowly come floating back to the line. And in our chapter 2 there is other testimony concerning objects moved without contact with human beings, either through the agency of fairies or of the dead. After due investigation of such and various other phenomena, Sir William Crookes, among other theories to explain them, gives this theory: the actions of a separate order of beings, living on this earth, but invisible and immaterial to us. Able, however, occasionally to manifest their presence. Known in almost all countries and ages as demons, not necessarily bad, gnomes, fairies, kobolds, elves, goblins, puck, and 638. Here we seem to have what ought to be, by this stage of our study, proof of the psychological theory of the nature and origin of the fairy faith. Let us now draw a few of the direct parallels thus suggested. Consider first how a fairy is said to appear, how it is described, and how it vanishes. And then compare the facts stated in the following case of a phantom reported by Sir William Crookes 639 in the dusk of the evening, just the time when fairies are most easily seen, during a séance with Mr. Home at my house. The curtains of a window about 8 feet from Mr. Home were seen to move. A dark, shadowy, semi-transparent form, like that of a man, was then seen by all present standing near the window, waving the curtain with his hand. As we looked, the form faded away and the curtain ceased to move. The following Mr. Home, as in the former case being the medium, is a still more striking instance. A phantom form came from a corner of the room, took an accordion in its hand, and then glided about the room playing the instrument. The form was visible to all present for many minutes, Mr. Home also being seen at the same time. On its coming rather close to a lady who was sitting apart from the rest of the company, she gave a slight cry, upon which it vanished. Compare the following types of observed phenomena by the same authority with what our Welsh witness from the Pentre Evans country said about death candles. Page 155, I have seen a luminous cloud floating upwards to a picture. Or, I have more than once had a solid self-luminous body placed in my hand by a hand which did not belong to any person in the room. In the light I have seen a luminous cloud hover over a heliotrope on a side table, break a sprig off, and carry the sprig to a lady. And on some occasions I have seen a similar luminous cloud visibly condense to the form of a hand and carry small objects about. Similar lights, parallel to the death lights or death tokens observed by Celtic percipients in Wales and in Brittany. And to what in Ireland are called the lights of the good people or gentry, all of which phenomena are traceable to no material causes as yet discovered, are reported by Iamblichus and others of his school. 640. And such lights are among phenomena best attested by modern psychical researchers. Supernormally produced music, said to have been produced by demons, which is parallel to that called by several of our own percipients fairy music, was also known to the Neoplatonists, 641, and in the scientific investigations to which Mr. Home was subjected, musical sounds were heard which could not be attributed to any known agency. In haunted houses, as psychical research discovers, the rustling of dresses, movements of objects, and sounds, often occur spontaneously without and with the occurrence of apparitions. 642. And these phenomena are parallel to certain ones which we have had cited by Celtic percipients as due to fairies. Mr. Lang, too, has set forth clearly the probability of real haunts or spirits possessing particular places, just as fairies are said to possess particular localities or buildings in Celtic lands. The report on the census of hallucination by Professor Sidgwick's committee has furnished data sufficiently good to convince many scientists that phantoms, comparable in a way with Irish banshees and the Breton ancu, do appear to the living directly before a death as though announcing it. 643. According to other equally reliable data, sometimes a phantasmal voice like certain fairy voices has given news of a death. Myers and others have studied and recorded many cases of the dead appearing, as the Celtic dead appear when they have been taken to fairyland. 644. In Phantasms of the Living, by Gurney, Myers, and Podmore, the explanation of apparitions which are coincident with a death as being generated by a telepathic influence exerted upon the percipient by the dying friend, suggests the most rational interpretation of certain parallel kinds of apparitions, of the dead or of fairies, who, as in these last examples, appear dressed in garments. It is that all such apparitional appearances, coincident with a death or not, are equally due to a telepathic force exerted by an agency independent of the percipient. This outside force acts as a stimulus upon the nervous apparatus of the person to whom it is thus transmitted, and causes him to project out of some part of his own consciousness, which part may have passed over into the subconsciousness, a visualized image already impressed there. The image has natural affinity or correspondence with the outside stimulus which arouses it. Such an hypothesis curiously agrees in part with the one put forth by our seer witness, the Irish mystic, page 60 ff. He would probably agree as to the visualization process in most types of ordinary apparitions. In addition, he holds that nature herself has a memory. There is some indefinable psychic element in the Earth's atmosphere upon which all human and physical actions or phenomena are photographed or impressed. These records in nature's mind correspond to mental impressions in us. Under certain inexplicable conditions, normal persons who are not seers may observe nature's mental records like pictures cast upon a screen, often like moving pictures. Seers can always see them if they wish, and uncritical seers frequently mistake these phantom records or pictures existing on the psychical envelope of the planet for actual events now occurring, and for actual beings, fairies of various kinds and the dead. A recent book entitled An Adventure, by Elizabeth Morrison and Francis Lamont, pseudonyms, adequately illustrates what we mean by such phantom pictures. During the year 1901, these two cultured ladies saw at Le Petit Trianon of Marie Antoinette records in the mind of nature of past historical events dating from about 1789. Of this there seems not to be the slightest doubt. The fairy boat race on Loch Gur, as described by Count John de Salis, page 80, and the procession seen on Tara Hill of fairies, like soldiers of ancient Ireland in review, page 33, probably illustrate the same kind of phenomena, cf. pages 55-7, 68, 74, 123, 126, and but in visions by natural seers, following again the theory of our Irish seer witness. There is present not only an outside force, as seems to be the case when ordinary apparitions are seen, but also a veridical being with a form and life of its own in a world of its own. Such a real entity is as distinct from a picture in the memory of nature as a living person is distinct from the mental picture which his friend holds and projects as a visualized image when responding to a telepathic stimulus sent by him. The natural seer, not being obliged to see with his normal sense of vision, need not use the normal method, namely, visualization, of responding to the outside telepathic stimulus, and so does not see the ordinary apparitional ghost or fairy. He exercises second sight or ecstatic vision, and while so doing is in the same plane of consciousness and under the same conditions of perception as the intelligence which projects upon him the stimulus, inducing automatically such second sight or ecstatic vision. Therefore, if the intelligence has a form and nature of its own, the seer and not the non-seer will perceive them in their own world while his consciousness is temporarily functioning there and out of the normal plane of mental action. In other words, in the normal plane the non-seer reacts normally upon the same stimulus upon which the seer reacts abnormally. The former percipient sees a non-real apparition, a visualized image out of his own experience. The latter claims to see a real being. The real being exists normally under conditions which are abnormal to the non-seer, but which to the seer become normal. The visualization of the non-seer is a makeshift, a psychophysical reaction to a purely psychical stimulus. It is mathematically possible to conceive fourth-dimensional beings, and if they exist it would be impossible in a third-dimensional plane to see them as they really are. Hence the ordinary apparition is non-real as a form, whereas the beings, which wholly sane and reliable seers claim to see when exercising seership of the highest kind, may be as real to themselves and to the seers as human beings are to us here in this third-dimensional world when we exercise normal vision. Concerning actual demon possession, which among spiritualists and psychical researchers would be called spirit phenomena through mediums, and which, as we have elsewhere pointed out, pages 249 ff. offers the most rational explanation for the changeling belief and related Celtic beliefs about fairies. Dr. J. L. Nevius, in his Demon Possession, offers very important scientific data relating to China. Dr. F. F. Elmwood, who like that authority studied strange psychical phenomena in the interior districts of the Shantung province, China, for many years, says in an introductory note to that work antecedently to any knowledge of the New Testament, so full of cases of demon possession, the people of North China believed fully in the possession of the minds and bodies of men by evil spirits. It has always been understood that the personality of the evil spirit usurped, or for the time being supplanted, that of the unwilling victim, and acted through his organs and faculties. Physical suffering and sometimes violent paroxysms attended the presence and active influence of the spirit. In the face of so many cases of such phenomena observed in China by the same authorities, Dr. Ellenwood adds, as Dr. Nevius's conclusion, that no theory has been advanced which so well accords with the facts as the simple and unquestioning conclusion so universally held by the Christians of Shantung, viz. that evil spirits do in many instances possess or control the mind and will of human beings. Hypnotism shows how one strong and magnetic human will can control the mind and will of its subject. The scientific results attained by the Society for Psychical Research in its study of spiritualism show a disembodied will or intelligence controlling and using the body of a living human being, and Dr. Nevius writes, now may not demon possession be only a more advanced form of hypnotism? Criminal records of Europe and America show many examples of condemned criminals who confessed in all sincerity that some invisible or outside influence led them against their better judgment to commit crime. And very often in such examples the past lives of the condemned are so good as to set up a strong probability in favor of their belief in possession. And altogether in accord with the evidence of modern mediumship, as well as that of mediumship among the ancients, Dr. Nevius says of Chinese demon possession, when normal consciousness is restored after one of these attacks, the subject is entirely ignorant of everything which has passed during that state. The most striking characteristic of those cases is that the subject evidences another personality, and the normal personality for the time being is partially or wholly dormant. The new personality presents traits of character utterly different from those which really belong to the subject in his normal state, and this change of character is, with rare exceptions, in the direction of moral obliquity and impurity. Many persons while demon-possessed give evidence of knowledge which cannot be accounted for in ordinary ways. They sometimes converse in foreign languages of which in their normal states they are entirely ignorant. There are often heard, in connection with demon possessions, rappings and noises in places where no physical cause for them can be found. And tables, chairs, crockery, and the like are moved about without, so far as can be discerned, any application of physical force, exactly as we are told is the case among spiritualists. 645. Conclusion. Our investigations, and far more exhaustive ones than ours touching similar psychical phenomena, show, when applied to the residuum or X quantity, these chief results: 1. The materialistic and the delusion and imposture theories can be dismissed as not affecting it. 2. Authorities do not agree in their opinions as to the pathological and psychological processes with which we are directly concerned. They are quite uncertain how to explain the human brain in all its more subtle functions, or the sympathetic nervous system and nervous states generally, in relation especially to human consciousness under various abnormal but not diseased conditions of the organism. And they do not propose any conclusions as final, but only as very weakly tentative, though some of these are in favor of a psychophysical view of man in which there is a close approach to the present more advanced position of psychical research. 3. Psychical research has furnished proof sufficient to convince such first-class scientists as Sir William Crookes, Sir Oliver Lodge, William James, M. Camille Flammarion, and others, that states of consciousness exist in nature outside of, though probably connected with, the consciousness of incarnate human beings. And that these intelligences can produce effects on matter and on the psychical constitution of man. And some of these scientists consider certain of such intelligences to be discarnate men and women. For, scientific proof has been adduced that there are genuine hallucinations like those relating to fairies of human-like forms, seen by single percipients or collectively. And such collective hallucinations are incapable of being explained away, which is equally true of apparitions seen by a single percipient to move physical objects. 5. Many of the foremost psychical researchers, including those named above, accept mediumship or spirit possession as the best working hypothesis to explain automatism. 6. In the accepted theory of telepathy we have support for assuming that, like hypnosis, it is a psychical process, and can be carried on either by two embodied spirits or human beings, or by a disembodied spirit and one still incarnate. Myers's theories, including that of the subliminal self, embody all the preceding ones and agree in details with them. 7. The results taken together harmonize with those attained in our study of psychical phenomena attributed by the Celtic peoples to fairies. And, if they be accepted, older psychological and pathological theories must be thoroughly revised in many cases, or else cast aside as worthless. Finally, since we have demonstrated that the background of the fairy faith, and hence the residuum or X quantity of it, is like the background of all religious and mystical beliefs, being animistic, and like them has grown up in ancient times out of definite psychical phenomena identical in character with those now studied by science, and is kept alive by an unbroken succession of seers and percipients. We have a clear right to set up under scientific authority these tentative conclusions. 1. Fairyland exists as a supernormal state of consciousness into which men and women may enter temporarily in dreams, trances, or in various ecstatic conditions, or for an indefinite period at death. 2. Fairies exist, because in all essentials they appear to be the same as the intelligent forces now recognized by psychical researchers, be they thus collective units of consciousness like what William James has called soul stuff, or more individual units, like veridical apparitions. 3. Our examination of living children said to have been changed by fairies shows, CPP 250-1, that many changelings are so called merely because of some bodily deformity or because of some abnormal mental or pathological characteristics capable of an ordinary rational explanation. B. But that other changelings who exhibit a change of personality, such as is recognized by psychologists, are in many cases best explained on the demon possession theory, which is a well-established scientific hypothesis. Therefore, since the residuum or X quantity of the fairy faith, the folk religion of the Celtic peoples, cannot be explained away by any known scientific laws, it must for the present stand. And the psychological theory of the nature and origin of the belief in fairies in Celtic countries is to be considered as hypothetically established in the eyes of science. Hence we must cease to look upon the term fairy as being always a synonym for something fanciful, non-real, absurd. We must also cease to think of the fairy faith as being no more than a fabric of groundless beliefs. In short, the ordinary non-Celtic mind must readjust itself to a new set of phenomena which through ignorance on its part it has been content to disregard, and to treat with ridicule and contempt as so much outworn superstition. Chapter 12. The Celtic Doctrine of Rebirth and Otherworld scientifically examined. If all things which partook of life were to die, and after they were dead remained in the form of death, and did not come to life again, all would at last die. And nothing would be alive, what other result could there be? Socrates, as reported by Plato. The soul, if immortal, existed before our birth. What is incorruptible must be ungenerable, Hume. If there be no reasons to suppose that we have existed before that period at which our existence apparently commences, then there are no grounds for supposing that we shall continue to exist after our existence has apparently ceased. Shelley. The extension of the terms fairy and fairyland, the real man as an invisible force acting through a body conductor, a psychical organ essential for memory, pre-existence, a scientific necessity, the vitalistic view of evolution, old theory of heredity disproved, embryology supports rebirth doctrine, psychophysical evolution, memory of previous existences in subconsciousness examples, dream psychology furnishes clearest illustrations, no post-existence without pre-existence, resurrection as rebirth, the circle of life, the mystical corollary. Conclusion: the Celtic doctrine of rebirth and otherworld is essentially scientific. In the esoteric fairy faith, the terms fairy and fairyland attain their broadest meaning. To the Celtic mystic, the universe is divisible into two interpenetrating parts or aspects, the visible in which we are now, and the invisible which is fairyland or the otherworld. And a fairy is an intelligent being, either embodied as a member of the human race or else resident in the otherworld. The latter class includes many distinct hierarchies and lower orders. Some, like the highest of the Tuatha De Danann, who are the same in character as the gods of the Greeks and Hindus, are superhuman, others are the souls of the dead, while many are subhuman and have never been embodied in gross physical bodies. These last include demons, incorrectly regarded by Christian and other theologies as being in all cases evil, and called demons, and other like spirits, such as those which Dr. Tyler, in Primitive Culture, has designated nature spirits, leprechauns, pixies, knockers, korrigans, lutins, little folk, elves generally, and their counterparts in all non-Celtic fairy faiths, which are the elementals of medieval mystics. In the preceding chapter chiefly the lower species of fairies were under consideration, but now the higher orders, including human souls embodied and disembodied, in their relation toward one another, are to be considered independently. It becomes necessary, then, to present here a view of life and death not yet scientifically orthodox. The Celt in all ages of his long history, like the ancient Greek thinkers with whom his ancestors were contemporary, has always been inclined, unlike modern scientists, to seek an explanation for the phenomena of evolutionary life by postulating a noumenal world of causes as the background of the phenomenal world of effects. Today, the rapid march of scientific pioneers, chiefly those in psychical research, is bringing our own cold and exact science very close to that indefinable boundary which separates the two worlds. And for that reason alone a presentation of the Celtic theory of the causes operating to produce death and birth will be, at least by way of suggestion, of some value. Facts of common everyday knowledge are apt to lose their significance through too great familiarity. A fact of this character is that when each child is born it must awaken into life. Often it is not known whether the newly born babe is dead or alive until it stretches forth its arms and breathes or cries. And this phenomenon of our first awakening and entry upon the visible plane of life and conscious action seems to corroborate what the early Celt who thoughtfully observed it held to be true. And what the Celt of today holds to be true, that the material substance composing the body of man is merely a means of expression for life, a conductor for an unknown force which exhibits volition and individual consciousness. Just as material substance in a condition called inanimate is a conductor for another unknown force called electricity, which does not exhibit any volition or consciousness. Destroy the human body, and there is no manifestation of its life force. Destroy a wire, and there is no manifestation of electric light. The human body seems to be merely incidental in the history of the individual consciousness, as a wire is incidental to electric light. But is this consciousness of man which we call life simply a phenomenon of matter non-existent without a physical means of expression? Or does it, like electricity after the wire is destroyed, continue to exist in an unmanifested state when the human body is cold and motionless in death? And in the case of a child born dead, has this consciousness found some organic imperfection in the newly constructed infant body which made its manifestation impossible? A few thoughts to aid in answering these questions will probably suggest themselves if we briefly consider the great difference between a human body in life and a human body in death. In life, there is the highly organized, delicately adjusted, perfectly balanced human body responding to the will of an invisible power. And it is admitted by all schools of philosophers, moralists, and scientists that this invisible power, whatever it may be, is the real man. This invisible power, beginning its manifestation through a microscopic bit of germplasm, gradually builds for itself a more and more complex physical habitation, until, after the short space of 9 months, it claims membership among the ranks of men. During the many years of its sojourn on our planet, it renews its habitation many times. Every atom it began with in childhood is discarded and replaced by a new one long before the age of manhood is reached, and yet upon reaching manhood the invisible power remembers what it did in a child's frame. This indicates that memory or consciousness as a psychical process does not depend essentially upon a material brain nor upon a certain grouping of ever-changing brain substance. For if it did, apparently it would slowly and imperceptibly undergo change as completely as the whole physical body and brains. This physiological process furnishes sufficient data to allow us to postulate that there is a psychical organ of memory behind the physical sense consciousness. And that such an organ in itself is, at least during a human life period, unchanging in its composition. Without such an organ, the process of memory when more fully analyzed, in a way we cannot here attempt, is inexplicable. 646. The simplest hypothesis is to conceive that organ as the one connected with the subconsciousness or supersense consciousness, by means of which the invisible power or rememberer is able to remember and to impress its memory upon the temporary and continually unstable physical brain. In the process of memory there must be first of all a thing to be remembered, second, a record of that thing to be remembered, and third, something to remember that thing. The thing remembered is the result of a conscious experience, the record of it the result of its impress at the time it was experienced, but the rememberer is neither. That invisible power, which we have called the real man's animates the body, it places food in it as fuel to produce animal heat, animal vitality and force, and tries to keep it in good working order as long as possible. If the body is imperfect at birth or becomes so later, that invisible power is forced to act through it imperfectly. If the brain is diseased, there is insanity, if undeveloped, idiocy. And when the body ceases to respond either perfectly or imperfectly, the invisible power must surrender it entirely, and there is what we call death. Now what is this invisible power or force which has entirely vanished, leaving the physical body and brain cold and motionless? Let us see if there is an answer. Chemical analysis proves that the visible parts of the body of man are merely transformed gases, but in a complete analysis of a living body such as man's there are certain elements to be considered which are always invisible. 647 Thus at death there is instantly a cessation of all bodily consciousness of all willing, thinking, movement. The power which has made the body conscious, and which cannot be compared to any known form of matter, is entirely gone. But there is left in the body a moment after its departure everything which we know to be material: the animal heat, the animal magnetism, the animal vitality. When these are gone, the body is cold and stiff, and in no essential way unlike any other mass of inert matter. If heat be applied to the body, or magnetism, or vital forces, there is nothing in it to retain them any more than there would be in a stone. The real man is gone. Then the body begins to disintegrate. The law of the conservation of energy and the indestructibility of matter makes it certain that in the process of death nothing has been lost, certainly nothing material. The animal heat has gone off somewhere in the atmosphere or in some other matter. The animal magnetism and vitality are momentarily lost sight of, but soon they will be attached to other organic beings such as plants or animals to begin a new cycle of embodiment. The physical constituents of the body will go to their appropriate places, into the air as gases, into the water as fluids, into the earth as salts and minerals, and in a short time may form the parts of a flower, or fruit, or animal. But where or what is the willing, the thinking, the remembering, the directing force which once controlled all these and held them together in unity? Ultraviolet rays are invisible, but they show their existence through their chemical action. Similarly, a soul or ego may exist invisibly and show its existence through the vital and physical unity manifested by a living human being. As we have already seen in the preceding chapter, there are a number of the first men of science who feel that when all the data of the latest scientific discoveries in the realm of psychology and of psychical research are impartially examined, there is no escape from some such hypothesis as the ancient hypothesis of a soul. If we accept the soul hypothesis, as it seems we must, and regard a soul as an indestructible unit of invisible power possessing consciousness and volition, and normally able to exist independently of a human body, then it becomes a logical and a scientific necessity to postulate its pre-existence, because as such a unit it is indestructible, in accordance with the law of the conservation of energy and indestructibility of matter. We speak here not of the ordinary soul or human personal consciousness, but of that ego which Celtic mystics conceive as the permanent principle, though probably itself relative to some still higher power, behind the personality which, in turn, they believe is a temporary combination wholly dependent upon the ego. Accordingly, it is scientifically possible for such a soul as a homogeneous unit of force or conscious energy to pass from one mass of matter or physical body to another without disintegration, diminution, or loss of its own identity. It is scientifically certain, also, from experiments performed to test the power of resistance to decomposition exhibited by the force which we call life in an organic body, that such a force is capable of outwearing many physical embodiments. 648 recent demonstrations tend to show that the heredity hypothesis cannot be held to account fully for such widely varied character or soul individuality as may be exhibited by members of one family. We must therefore account for mental, moral, and certainly psychical inequalities among our race by some other hypothesis. And no hypothesis is more scientific, more in line with known physiological and psychical processes, or more in accord with the law of evolution, than that of rebirth. The theory of the mechanical transmission of acquired characteristics in a purely physical manner through the germplasm is no longer tenable when all the data of physiology and psychology are admitted. A vitalistic view of evolution is rapidly developing in the scientific world, and the weight of evidence is decidedly in favor of regarding all evolutionary processes, reaching from the lowest to the highest organisms, as illustrating a gradual unfolding in the sensuous world of a pre-existing psychical power through an ever-increasing complexity of specialized structures, this complexity being brought about by natural selection. Such a view is also strongly supported if not confirmed by the general scientific belief that spontaneous generation of life is and always has been impossible on our planet or on any planet. There must have been life before its physical manifestation or its physical evolution began. We may regard this psychical power as like a vast reservoir of consciousness ever trying to force itself through matter, the walls of the reservoir. Through the microscopic body of an amoeba there has percolated a very minute drop from the reservoir. As evolution advances, the walls of the reservoir become more and more porous, and little by little the drop increases to a tiny rivulet. Through the higher animals, the tiny rivulet flows as a brook. Through man as he is, the brook flows as a deep and broad river. Throughout the completely evolved man of the far distant future, the deep and broad river will have overflowed all its banks, it will have inundated and completely overwhelmed the animal-human nature of the individual through whom it flows. As the whole volume of the vast reservoir pours itself out, the ordinary consciousness of man will then have been transmuted into the subconsciousness, of which it had always been a pale reflection. In other words, if the theory of the mechanical transmission of acquired characteristics has failed, as seems to be the case, then we must assume that there is, as the bearer of all gains made from generation to generation, some sort of psychical or vitalistic principle. This, making use of the germplasm merely as a physical basis for its manifestation, begins to build up a body suited to its further evolutionary needs. The brilliant discoveries of Dr. Jacques Loeb and of M. Yves Delage have demolished absolutely the old idea that each organ and each tissue contained in embryo in the normal egg germ must develop in a particular and coordinate way into a normal organism, and after the parental type, it is possible to make a head grow where there ought to be feet. And at Zurich, Stan Fuss, solely through changing the temperature of his laboratory, was able to obtain from the same species of butterfly forms which were tropical and forms which were arctic. 649 All this helps to establish the hypothesis, which amounts to certainty, that the conformation of a physical body, or even the kind of species to be born, is directly determined by physical environment and not by heredity. And that the chief factor to consider in organisms is the life animating the body. Physical environment affects only the physical organism, it does not affect the invisible and unknown life principle resident within the physical organism. The process of fertilization is a physical process. As such it is simply initiatory to embryonic evolution, which also is physical. Once the proper physical conditions are set up by the parents, life pursues its marvelous progress in the womb of the human mother, from the amoeba-like initial embryo to man. That is to say, parents set in motion the laws governing the reproduction of physical bodies. They create such conditions as enable the invisible life force to begin its physical manifestation. 650 In the two fused germs from the parents resides the physical inheritance of the offspring, to be outwardly shaped by environment. But the physical inheritance is a thing distinct from the psychical part of the living being, just as much as the dead human body is a thing apart from the life which has left it. Though the old heredity theory is overthrown by late discoveries, the question as to what life is in human bodies under all possible environmental conditions remains unsolved. And so do the questions why there should be sports in nature, which among man are called geniuses, and why every human being has a distinct and highly developed individual character, essentially unlike that of his immediate ancestors. Embryology proves conclusively that the human embryo retraces in its growth the evolution of lower life forms. At first consisting of two single cells fused into one, it is like the amoeba. By cell division it grows and progresses step by step through each lower realm of being until it comes to be a water creature with gills, and science teaches that all organic life on this planet once dwelt in the seas. It grows progressively out of the water-world stage of organic life into the world of air-breathing creatures. Nature at last achieves her highest product, and a human being is born out of the womb of time. The initial microscopic bit of germplasm is endowed with power of motion, thought, and human consciousness, with dominion over all the lower kingdoms through which by right of ancient conquests it passed in the brief period of 9 months. On every side the problem of life is full of poetry and wonder. It is the greatest mystery. Not only can we thus study the age-long evolution of the physical man, but we have recently acquired sufficient scientific data to lay foundations for a study of the evolution of the psychical man. Thus, for example, instincts seem to be nothing more than habits which through unknown periods of time have become so ingrained in the constitution of man, and of all animals, that now they have become second nature and usually are exercised without the need of reasoning processes. The influence from innate sensuous experiences rises into consciousness as the life of every normal child and youth unfolds itself. And these experiences in their full expansion, when the age of maturity has been reached, constitute in their unity what we call character, which, in one sense, may be defined as the sum total of instincts of every kind. From such a point of view, the psychical or invisible power in man is merely a bundle of acquired habits which make use of the bodily organism in order to express themselves in the same way, as we have pointed out. That electrical forces manifest their presence through a conductor. If these habits be good, we call their possessor a good man; if evil, we call him an evil man. The theory of Charles Darwin suggests that all evolutionary progress is directed to the acquirement of newer and ever higher instincts. And if this process be the true one, that is to say, if all instincts, which in their finer distinctions mark off species from species in all animal kingdoms, be as Darwin thought and as is today more clearly evident the result of a long and gradual evolution through experience in a sensuous realm of existence, then it would seem to follow that there must be some kind of a monad, probably a non-sensuous one, to which such acquired instincts can attach themselves. Such a monad, too, must have been a percipient and hence a recorder of such ever-accumulating experiences throughout an inconceivably long chain of lives, and it of itself must, while so perceiving and recording, not be subject to the transitoriness of the sensuous realm wherein it gathers together these instincts, which in their unified expression form its personality or human character. In harmony with the vitalistic view of evolution, which implies a pre-existent psychical power continually striving to express itself completely through matter, yet normally able to exist independently of a physical means of expression, we should regard such high mental processes as judgment, reasoning, analysis and synthesis, and spatial perception, along with memory, as resultants of very great experience in a sensuous world, on which in our present psychophysical constitution such processes appear to have direct bearing. In other words, for man to be able to exercise such high mental processes there is need to postulate incalculable ages of specialization in the nervous apparatus, and in psychophysical adjustment, of a kind which has thus enabled the psychical power to express itself to such a supreme degree in the realm of mind and matter. The same vitalistic argument is applicable to the lower mental processes and to the instinctual powers in man, because we cannot at any time, in viewing the complete evolution of man as a twofold being composed of a physical and a psychical part, force aside Fechner's conviction that the problem is a psychophysical one. A study of sexual instincts in children seems to confirm this point. 651. Such a psychical and vitalistic hypothesis is, as we have seen, strongly supported by embryology. And embryology proves conclusively the need of long ages of physical evolution for the development of each tissue and highly specialized organ in the human body. Certain French and German and other scientists of the vitalistic school have demonstrated physiologically the need of a pre-existent power as the unifying principle which attracts and compels material atoms to group themselves into the pattern of the human body 652 or, as we may add, of any organic body. Psychical researchers at the outset of their science seem apparently to have demonstrated psychologically the post-existence of the personal consciousness unity. And it is very likely when further progress has been made in psychics that there will arise a logical need to postulate, in addition to the personal consciousness unity, a hypothetical pre-existent soul monad as the unifying principle which attracts and compels psychical atoms of experience, if such an expression may be used, to group themselves into the personal consciousness unity which appears to survive the death of the gross physical body for a long or short time, as future research may show. 653 Such a soul monad, to follow the view held by Celtic mystics, led by acquired instincts which were transmitted to it through the personality, held by the Celtic esoteric doctrine to be a temporary combination, apparently weaves out of matter the body unit adapted to its further evolution, in a way analogous to that in which a silkworm is led by acquired instincts to weave a cocoon. This body unit is twofold: 1, the visible body derived from the visible elements of matter, and, 2, the invisible or ghost body derived from the invisible or ethereal elements of matter. Strictly speaking, for the Celtic mystic this soul monad is something upon which the personal consciousness depends for its psychical unity in precisely the same way as the physical body depends upon the personal consciousness for its physical unity. The Celtic mystic holds that just as the body unity falls back again into its primal elements of matter, so the personal consciousness unity, apparently able to survive in the ghost body for a long period after its separation from the grosser physical envelope or human body, also in due time is discarded by the soul monad or individuality, and then falls back into its primal psychical constituents. In other words, the Celtic esoteric doctrine of rebirth correctly interpreted does not conceive personal immortality, but it conceives a greater kind of immortality, the immortality of the unknown principle which gives unity to each temporary personality it makes use of, and which we prefer to designate as the individuality, the impersonator. And this individuality is the bearer of all evolutionary gains made in each temporary personality through which it reflects itself. It is the permanent evolving principle. Perhaps an analogy drawn from nature will make the Celtic position clearer. We may say that the personality occupies a position between the human body and the soul monad, just as the moon occupies a position between the earth and the sun. Personal consciousness is to the human body what the moonlight is to the earth, merely a pale reflection from a third thing, the soul monad or individuality, which is the ultimate source of both sets of unities. The material or body unity in its twofold aspect and the psychical or personal consciousness unity. Each personality is temporary, while the individuality, like the sun in relation to the earth and moon, is capable of at least a relative immortality. The sun's light, as science holds, existed before there was any moon to reflect it on to the earth, and may continue to exist when both the moon and earth are disintegrated. The essential nature of the sun's energy or life remains unknown to science, so does the essential nature of the energy or life manifesting itself as the individuality. Though all such analogies are more or less weak, this one adequately fits in with the theories concerning the Celtic esoteric doctrine of rebirth which the most learned of contemporary Celts, chiefly mystics, have favored us with. And it is our rare privilege to put these theories on record for whatever they may be worth. The best hypothesis is always the one which best explains all available data, and, to our mind, when very minutely examined, in a way which, chiefly for reasons of space, cannot be attempted here. This Celtic hypothesis concerning the nature and destiny of man is the best hitherto adduced. 654. Objectors to the rebirth doctrine as held by the Celts and other peoples anciently and now, naturally ask why, if we have lived before here on earth in physical bodies, we do not remember it. But the shallowness and unscientific nature of this question is at once apparent to psychologists who know that there exists in man a subconscious mind which in the great mass of people is almost totally dormant. The subconscious self, wrote William James, is nowadays a well-accredited psychological entity. Apart from all religious considerations, there is actually and literally more life in our total soul than we are at any time aware of. And he added, it thus is scientific to interpret all otherwise unaccountable invasive alternations of consciousness as results of the tension of subliminal memories reaching a bursting point. 655 Intuition, which all men have experienced, would seem to be the result of a momentary contact by the physical brain with its psychical counterpart the subconscious self. The individuality is distinguished from the personality. Certain observed psychological processes in ordinary men and women, who never really know that they have a subconsciousness or transcendental self, prove that it exists even for them. And any part of man which exists and functions of itself can be developed so as to be consciously perceived. This is incontestable. Let us point out a few of these observed and recorded psychological processes. There may be an unsolved problem in the mind, or inability to recall a certain name or fact, and then a sudden, unexpected intuitional solving of the problem and an instantaneous recollecting of the desired facts. At a time when the ordinary mind may be entirely absorbed in altogether foreign thoughts. Again, many persons through accident or disease have lost their memory to such an extent as to require complete re-education, and then in time, gradually or instantaneously, as the case may be, have completely recovered it. 656 And we noticed in our study of supernatural lapse of time, page 469, that at the moment of accidental loss of consciousness, as in drowning for example, all forgotten details of life are instantaneously reproduced in a complete panorama. These psychological processes support what we have said above with respect to a psychical organ being behind the sense consciousness, and seem thus to prove that the subconscious mind is the place for recording permanently all experiences. 657 Under hypnosis, a subject may be requested to perform a certain act, let us say 11,999 minutes after the moment of making the request. When the hypnotic condition is removed, the subject has no personal consciousness of the suggestion, but, as different experiments have proved conclusively, he invariably performs the act exactly at the expiration of the 11,999 minutes without knowing why he does so. This proves that there is a subconsciousness in man which can take full cognizance of such a suggestion, which can keep count of the passing of time and then cause the unconscious personality to act in response to its will. 658 Again, in extreme old age people who have come to have an imperfect memory or none at all in their normal consciousness. Under abnormal conditions, which seemingly are due to a temporary influx of a latent psychical power into the physical body and brain, or else to an awakening of a dormant force within the physical body and brain themselves, often regain, for a time, complete and clear memory of their childhood. This proves that the memory is somewhere still perfect, and that it does not reside in the consciousness of the age-exhausted physical brain and memory. Albert Moll, in his treatise on hypnotism, says that events in the normal life which have dropped out of memory can be remembered in hypnosis. An English officer in Africa was hypnotized by Hansen, and suddenly began to speak a strange language. This turned out to be Welsh, which he had learnt as a child, but had forgotten. 659 And even memory of acts done in hypnotic somnambulism can be awakened in the normal state. 660 Furthermore, through psychoanalysis, as Professor Freud has shown, forgotten dreams and dreams which were never complete in the ordinary consciousness can be recovered in their entirety out of the subconsciousness. 661 How many of us can recall without some mental stimulus certain acts performed 10 years ago? A good deal of our present life is no longer vivid, much of it is forgotten, and in old age many of the memories of youth and of mature life will be subconscious. If this brain, whose total existence is comprised between birth and death, cannot remember in a normal way all its own experiences, how could it be expected to know anything at all of hypothetical past lives where there were various physical brains long ago disintegrated unless the hypothetically ever-existing transcendental individuality, whose consciousness is the subconsciousness, be made by some unusual psychical stimuli to transmit its memory of the past lives to each new brain it creates. In other words, to have memory of pre-existent conditions there must be continuity of association with present conditions. If such continuity exists, it exists in the subconsciousness. And if it exists therein, then in order to recall in the present personal or ordinary consciousness, which began at birth, memory of an anterior state of consciousness, it would be necessary to hold impressed upon the present physical brain and body a clear and unremittent consciousness of the subconsciousness. In relation to our personal consciousness, apparently our greatest powers lie in the subconsciousness which is sleeping and in embryo, awaiting to be born into the consciousness of this world through the slow process of evolutionary gestation. In the case of a Buddha, who on good historical authority is said to have been able to recall all past existences from the lowest to the highest, this evolutionary process seems to have reached completion. 662. Under ordinary conditions, individuals have been known to see a place which they have never seen before, or to do a thing which they have never done before in this life nor in any conscious dream state. And yet feel that they have seen the place before and done the thing before. M. Th. Ribot, in his Diseases of Memory, Chapter 4, has brought together many cases of this kind. Some are undoubtedly explicable as forgotten experiences of the present life. Others, to our mind, strongly support the theory of pre-existent experiences preserved in memory in the subconsciousness. Under chloroform or other anesthetics, patients often recover for the time being forgotten facts of experience, and sometimes appear to make momentary contact with their subconsciousness and to exhibit therein another personality. In certain well-defined types of double personality, which are not the kind due to demon possession nor to spirit possession as in mediumship, there are two memories, each complete and absolutely independent of the other. 663 And in similar cases, where the subject exhibits alternately numerous personalities, we see the individuality, that is to say the subconscious man, exhibiting, as a dramatist might, various characters or personalities of probable past existences according as each is most active at the moment. Similarly, crystal gazing sometimes seems not only to revive lost memories of this life, but also to call up subconscious memories of some unknown state of consciousness which may be from a previous life. 664. M. Ribot has made it clear from his careful study of numerous cases of amnesia, loss of memory, that recollections return in an inverse order to that in which they disappear. For example, a celebrated Russian astronomer lost all memory save that of his childhood, and in recovering it there appeared first the recollections of youth, then those of middle age, then the experiences of later years, and, finally, the most recent events. Many even more marked examples of the law of regression in amnesia are given by M. Ribot. We conclude from them that all strange and apparently long-forgotten facts of experience arising in consciousness out of the subconsciousness, as in the different cases which have been cited above, would necessarily be those which have been the longest lost to memory. And hence if they cannot be attached to this present life then they can only be derived from a former life, because every primary detail of memory must always originate from an experience at some past period of time. M. Ribot himself, in his conclusion to the Diseases of Memory, makes this significant observation with respect to the law of regression in amnesia. This law of regression provides us with an explanation for extraordinary revivification of certain recollections when the mind turns backward to conditions of existence that had apparently disappeared forever. In dreams there is a great wealth of latent memory. Sometimes memory of the present waking life, but often not capable, apparently, of being attached to it, nor explicable as due to the soul wandering from the body during sleep. The hypothesis of rebirth seems to be the only adequate one here. Certain dreams suggest that man possesses innate memories extending backwards to prehistoric times, cf. page 5 above. This fits in with Professor Freud's theory in his Die Traumdeutung, that the dream is nothing else than the concealed fulfillment of a repressed wish. Some dreams are in the form of frightful, cruel, horrible scenes, which seem frightful to us, but in a certain depth of the unconscious satisfy wishes which, in the prehistoric ages of our own mental development, were actually recognized as desires. 665 This also supports our vitalistic view of the evolution of human instincts. Again, in somnambulism there is a much more exalted memory, and clear cases are on record of facts being then consciously present which cannot be accounted for save through the same hypothesis. 666. If we keep in mind the psychology of the dream state, we shall probably get the clearest intellectual theory as to why, if pre-existence be true, we do not remember various previous states of existence. In our present state of consciousness we may enter a dream state, in that dream state by dreaming we enter a second dream state, and theoretically, though not by common experience, there may be no limit to superimposed dream states. Each one in itself a state of consciousness distinct from the waking consciousness. Accordingly, if, as Wordsworth put it, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting of another state of consciousness, and death the abrupt ending of that sleep of dreams and a waking up, or if the direct opposite be true, and death is the entrance to a sleep and dream state of consciousness, it becomes very clear how difficult it would be for us here now either to recall what we may have dreamt or have actually done in another state of conscious existence corresponding to our present one. The subtle thinkers of modern India, who completely accept the doctrine of rebirth as a universal law, have summed up this abstruse aspect of the dream psychology as follows: the first or spiritual state was ecstasy. From ecstasy the ego, forgot itself into deep sleep, from deep sleep it awoke out of unconsciousness, but still within itself, into the internal world of dreams. From dreaming it passed finally into the thoroughly waking state, and the outer world of sense. 667 But our own psychologists are not yet far enough advanced to accept this. Much more work in psychical research must first be done before it will be possible for them to announce to the West that pre-existence is a necessary condition for post-existence which they now hypothetically accept. If for the present our standpoint be that of our own psychologists, we may then think of the human consciousness as a spectrum whose central parts alone are visible to us. Beyond at either end lies an unseen and to us unknown region, awaiting its explorer from the West. Each one of us is in reality an abiding psychical entity far more extensive than he knows, an individuality which can never express itself completely through any corporeal manifestation. The self manifests through the organism. But there is always some part of the self unmanifested, and always, as it seems, some power of organic expression in abeyance or reserve. 668 William James stated the position thus: the B region, another name for the region of subconsciousness, then, is obviously the larger part of each of us, for it is the abode of everything that is latent, and the reservoir of everything that passes unrecorded and unobserved. 669. Men of science see no way of accepting the doctrine of the resurrection of the physical body as at present interpreted by Christian theology, but the late Professor Th. Henri Martin, Dean of the Faculty of Letters of the University of Rennes, has suggested in his La Vie Future that the doctrine may be the exoteric interpretation of a long-forgotten esoteric truth. Namely, that the soul may be resurrected in a new physical body, and this is scientifically possible. 670. The ancient scientists called life a circle. In the upper half of this circle, or here on the visible plane, we know that in the physiological history of man and of all living things there is first the embryonic or prenatal state, then birth. And as life, like a sun, rises in its newborn power toward the zenith, there is childhood, youth, and maturity, and then, as it passes the zenith on its way to the horizon, there is decline, old age, and, finally, death. And as a scientific possibility we have in the lower half of the circle, in Hades or the otherworld of the Celts and of all peoples, corresponding processes between death and a hypothetical but logically necessary rebirth. 671. The logical corollary to the rebirth doctrine, and an integral part of the Celtic esoteric theory of evolution, is that there have been human races like the present human race who in past eons of time have evolved completely out of the human plane of conscious existence into the divine plane of conscious existence. Hence the gods are beings which once were men, and the actual race of men will in time become gods. Man now stands related to the divine and invisible world in precisely the same manner that the brute stands related to the human race. To the gods, man is a being in a lower kingdom of evolution. According to the complete Celtic belief, the gods can and do enter the human world for the specific purposes of teaching men how to advance most rapidly toward the higher kingdom. In other words, all the great teachers, e.g. Jesus, Buddha, Zoroaster, and many others, in different ages and among various races, whose teachings are extant, are, according to a belief yet held by educated and mystical Celts, divine beings who in inconceivably past ages were men but who are now gods, able at will to incarnate into our world, in order to emphasize the need which exists in nature. By virtue of the working of evolutionary laws, to which they themselves are still subject, for man to look forward, and so strive to reach divinity rather than to look backward in evolution and thereby fall into mere animalism. The stating of this mystical corollary makes the exposition of the fairy faith complete, at least in outline. As shown by the Bard das MSS. In our Chapter 7, the Celtic doctrine of rebirth is the scientific extension of Darwin's law as corrected, 672, that alone through traversing the circle of life man reaches that destined perfection which natural analogies, life's processes as exhibited by living things, and evolution, suggest, and from which at present man is so far removed. There seems to emerge this postulate: the world is the object of normal consciousness, the ego or soul monad the object of subconsciousness. And the subconsciousness cannot be realized in the world until through the normal consciousness of man the ego is able to function completely, and so endow man with full self-consciousness in matter. Which endowment seems to be the goal of all planetary evolution. We conclude that the otherworld of the Celts and their doctrine of rebirth accord thoroughly in their essentials with modern science. And, accordingly, with other essential elements in the complete Celtic fairy faith which we have in the preceding chapter found to be equally scientific. Establish our psychological theory of the nature and origin of that fairy faith upon a logical and solid foundation. And we now submit this study to the judgment of our readers. With more complete evidence in the future, both from folklore and from science, there will be, we trust, a better vindication of the theory, and perhaps finally there will come about its transformation into what it but seems to us to be now a fact. Some beliefs which a century ago were regarded as absurdities are now regarded as fundamentally scientific. In the same way, what in this generation is heretical alike to the Christian theologian and to the man of science may in coming generations be accepted as orthodox.